This episode of True Crime Conversations contains discussions of sexual assault, murder, kidnapping, and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. On Moorhouse Street in Willagee, Perth, sits a single-storey weatherboard house. Curtains hang inside the front window, and a concrete footpath leads to a dark front door. It's 1986, and its occupants are David and Catherine Birnie. They're not legally married, but Catherine has decided to take David's surname. Standing outside this simple, unimpressive home, there's no sign at all of what has taken place inside. But in November 1986, police will visit this quiet residence and make a series of discoveries that will lead to David and Catherine Birnie's arrest. Catherine will be only the third woman in all of Australian history to have her file marked never to be released. That house will be forever synonymous with 5 unimaginable crimes, known to the media as the Moorhouse Murders. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. This is the first episode of a 2-part series looking into the lives and crimes of David and Catherine Birnie. Joining me over the next 2 episodes is journalist and author Andrew Byrne. Andrew has produced a television documentary on the Birnies and worked closely covering the case as it made its way through the courts. He has worked with the only surviving victim of the Birnies and is currently writing a book detailing the malicious and truly vile crimes of the husband and wife serial killers. Let's begin with David Birnie. He was the oldest of 5 children and grew up in Wattle Grove, Western Australia. There were lots of rumours that plagued his family growing up. What were some of those?
Well, David Birnie was the eldest of 5 children, and his parents were alcoholics and they were sexual abusers. His father, who had a genetic deformity of the back, was 20 years older than Birnie's mother. She was a very unpopular woman in the neighbourhood, loud and uncouth. She didn't keep a clean house. She was shunned by the neighbours, and child welfare were tipped off all the time and regularly took the Birnies, David Birnie and his other 4 siblings, into temporary care. Things just got worse and worse. The kids, all the money the family had, and it wasn't very much, went on alcohol and cigarettes for the parents. There was never any food in the fridge. And indeed, when David Birnie and his siblings were taken into foster care, i.e. made ward of the state, he was only 11 years of age. But he already had a criminal record. In order to feed himself and his brothers and sisters, he was committing crimes at that age and then selling whatever he was stealing or exchanging it for food. It was a most unhappy childhood, and it's something that the psychiatrists who look back and study serial killers have been fascinated by.
There were rumours of incest that were circulated. For example, his younger brother once said that he needed to have sex all the time. This was probably further on into adolescence and early adulthood. But was that ever founded? Was there any evidence for that, or was that just a rumour?
I think it was probably more than a rumour, but it would be very hard. How do you get definitive proof of that? But I think what is significant is that many years later, when he was in jail, and indeed when he was arrested, David Birnie was always very open and happy to talk about the horrendous crimes that he committed and some of the things he did to the victims in great detail. But whenever he was asked about the neglect and the abuse he suffered at the hands of his parents, particularly his mother, he got very, very angry, violent almost, and wouldn't talk about it. Certainly when he became an adult and was no longer a ward of the state, he had a relationship of a kind with his father, but he very rarely, if ever, went back to see his mother.
His mother would have him on the bus on her knee. This baby was filthy, wet, neglected. She would give you the baby to hold while she pulled out her cigarettes and her comics. And I would look at this and I was thinking, this is not a mother. This little child, this isn't a mother. There was quite a bit of thought and talk that Margaret, David's mother, had the mental age of a 14-year-old.
Eventually he met a girl next door named Catherine, who was the same age as him, and she'd had a pretty traumatic upbringing too. What had happened to her?
Well, absolutely. Kathy was only 3 months younger than David Birnie. Her father had migrated to Australia from South Africa with his brother, had met his mother in Fremantle, and then Kathy came along not long afterwards. And then 2 years later, her mother fell pregnant again. But that was a very complicated delivery, and her mother died in childbirth. And 2 days after that, her newborn brother also died. So a real tragedy. Kathy was, I think, less than 2 years of age, left. Her single father couldn't cope at all, and he had to call on the services of a young family nearby to look after his daughter, to look after Kathy, while he went to work. That family was a foster family, but it was the Birnies. So David Birnie and Kathy were playmates at 4 years of age, and that was an enormous part, I think, of this story, because when they were to meet several years later, that was the catalyst, really, for a lot of what came later. Kathy had a very unhappy childhood. Her father eventually took her back to South Africa with him, but things didn't work out. He couldn't really cope with her in South Africa either. So he returned her on her own to Australia to live with her maternal grandmother, who was a very strict and austere woman. Wasn't a hugger and a kisser and didn't treat her with a lot of kindness. Kathy grew up a lonely child who was the girl at school who was never invited to sleepovers or to birthday parties. Very unhappy. So when, as I say, at the age of 11 and 12, David Birnie was now well into foster care, and one of his foster families moved into a new home, and it was only a couple of doors away from where Kathy was then living with her father, who'd returned from South Africa and got custody of her back again. They were about 13 years of age at that stage, and reunited, that really was the touch paper that set they became inseparable. Kathy's father didn't like David Birnie, but he couldn't keep them apart. And in fact, Kathy's father and David Birnie's father actually worked together in the same laundry at a Perth hospital for a while, which again kept the two families kind of in touch. But David and Kathy, from the age of about 13, 14, started to commit crimes together, became teenage lovers together, and who knows what would have happened at that stage. But there was what I call a sliding doors moment in the life of David Birnie, when at the age of 15, something would happen which he would later blame for sowing the seeds for the killing rampage that the two of them would go on later. So at age of 15, because of his upbringing in poverty, basically on the outskirts of Perth, he was a very small and skinny and undernourished teenager. But he was taken on as an apprentice jockey by a well-known Perth horse trainer who felt really sorry for him. The man even found, he was a well-known trainer, and he found somewhere for David Birnie to live, rooming with a local landlady who lived near to the racecourse. And this was a real opportunity, the only opportunity really, for David Birnie to turn his life around and to kind of carve himself a future, away from crime and poverty and whatever. But it was over almost before it began. Birnie didn't mix well with the other boys. They used to tease him, and his frustrations came out, and he was caught a few times being cruel to the horses. And then one night the trainer received a call from the landlady to say that Birnie had attacked her. He'd been wearing a mask and he tried to get into bed with her and demand sex. Her dog had barked, he panicked and fled. The trainer, of course, confronted Birnie, who denied all responsibility, but he was sacked on the spot. And years later, talking to psychologists, Birnie said that he was still maintaining his innocence to that day, to say that it wasn't him and that he'd been wrongly accused, and being wrongly accused had made him burn with rage against a world which he saw as very unfair. We have to remember that the Birnies really were, or are, in Australian terms, the rarest of the rare. Serial killing husband and wives is virtually unheard of. Off the top of my head, I can't think of another serial killing husband and wife in Australia. But that was the Birnies, and they were amongst the worst examples of multiple sex killers, lust killers they've been called. But what the psychiatrists and the psychologists say is that what these people have in common, and the FBI have studied the Birnies, they've studied all couples who become killers together. There are several subsections of serial killing couples. The most common is where there is a dominant partner, usually the man. But in the Birnies case, that wasn't the norm. They were equal. They were equals in this. And that, in fact, I would say that once you know the whole story of the Birnies, that the stronger, more dominant partner was Cathy Birnie, not David Birnie. They were both homicidal romantics, I suppose. They both derived satisfaction from murdering their victims. But it was Cathy who played an active role in enticing girls into the car with them, who tied up the victims using a knife that she carried. Yes, she was a voyeur, if you like. She stood and watched David Birnie when he was raping and sexually assaulting these girls initially. What was she doing? She was taking photographs and taking notes, copious notes, which were the trophies. We know that serial killers like to keep trophies, usually an item of jewellery or clothing. With the Birnies, it was the notes that Cathy kept and the photographs that she took. After they'd disposed of their victims, it was those notes and those photographs that used to keep them aroused, and they used in order to improve their sex lives together, or that's what they believed. And in fact, the first two victims, certainly of the victims for whom they were charged and convicted of murder, it was Cathy who killed those two girls. Yes, David Birnie began the attacks. They both took turns to strangle these girls, but it was Cathy who was strangling them at the time that they actually died. So it would be fair to say that this wasn't David Birnie, as has sometimes been painted, who was the dominant member of this partnership, and Cathy was this obsessed, besotted young woman with this man she adored. You can forget that kind of viewpoint here. Cathy was manipulative. She once told detectives that women were put on earth to service men. And she did say that to detectives. But what she didn't say is that men do what women want them to do. And with Cathy, that meant manipulation. And she could manipulate David Birnie to do anything she wanted.
That's interesting because we do have a propensity in stories like this to maybe give more agency to the men. It's difficult to believe sometimes that women can kill and that women are capable of doing such awful things, especially to other women. But one sort of moment in Catherine's life where it looked like she might be able to take another path was when she married a man named Donald McLaughlin. What was that relationship like?
Well, this is really fascinating. So we've talked about how David and Cathy were playmates at 4 years of age and then met again when they were teenagers. When he loses his job as an apprentice jockey, Cathy has left school at that point. She's working in a factory. David seeks her out and they start trawling Perth in a car looking for places to rob. One of the places that they steal from is a service station. They break in and steal a whole bunch of equipment. They have this grand plan. They were always making plans and plotting. Their big plan was to break into and have a heist at a drive-in cinema. Drive-in cinemas at that stage in the 80s did huge business. And they had this idea that they would break in dressed in wigs and masks and carrying shotguns, and that they would blow open the safe. They went to court after their arrest, and they appeared together in the court. And one of the first things that Cathy's solicitor stood up and said was that she was pregnant. Interestingly, the court was told that David Birnie wasn't the father of the child she was carrying. It was another unnamed teenager. But what that meant, and whether it was a deliberate, audacious ploy or it was good luck, I think probably the former, that while Birnie was sentenced to 9 months in jail, Cathy escaped with only probation. A month later, they were both back before the courts, pleading guilty to more burglary charges. Birnie got another 3 years, but Cathy, because she was pregnant mainly, and her background wasn't as bad in terms of known to the police as David Birnie, she still evaded prison. Fast forward a year, Cathy's gone through the pregnancy and she's had her first child, a boy. David Birnie escapes from jail, heads straight for Perth, teams up with Cathy. They'd remained in touch the entire time, and they're on the run together for 19 days. Now, during that 19 days, they commit more than 50 offences, everything from robbery to break and enter, theft, including they're found, eventually arrested, with over 100 sticks of gelignite, detonators, wigs, masks. So their plan for blowing open the safe at the cinema is still at the forefront of their minds, and that's what they were planning for. This time, of course, there was no way that Cathy was going to avoid a prison sentence. Birnie had another 3 years added to his sentence, and Cathy, just before she's sentenced, told the court that she loved Birnie so much that there was nothing she wouldn't do for him. Still, she got off pretty lightly, I reckon. She got 6 months in jail, and on her way being led from the dock to the cells below, she handed her baby over to social workers. And that, you would have thought, perhaps, was the end of the relationship, I suppose. David Birnie was then facing several years in jail. Cathy only 6 months, and she'd be out well before that if she behaved. And indeed, it looked like that is what happened. When it came time for Cathy to be released, she was interviewed by the probation service because she would be on probation, and she was warned that her life would get a lot easier and be a lot better if she stayed away from David Birnie. And she seemed to take that advice on board. She was released, reunited with her son, and she found a job, or her father found her a job, which was as a live-in housekeeper for a family in Fremantle. 12 months later, she married, and it was on her 21st birthday, she married the son of the family she was working for. Her husband was Don. He was a stocky former rodeo rider who was 10 years older than her. He called her my little China doll, and he was absolutely besotted with Cathy and would remain so to his dying day. On their wedding day, Cathy's 21st birthday, she was 3 months pregnant with her second child. And there's a magnificent photograph of Cathy posing for a wedding picture with Don. And you'd never have guessed because she was so slight. And this is the thing with the Birnies that people sometimes forget. You can guess at David Birnie's stature, being an apprentice jockey. He was very small, very slight, burly 5'5", I think he was, in the old scale. Whereas Cathy was even smaller and was so skinny, she weighed less than a couple of bags of cement. I mean, less than 40 kilos. She was tiny, bird-like almost. But she went off, settled down, it would seem, with Don, her husband. More children started to come. In total, Cathy would give birth to 7 children, 6 to Don. And while she was having her children and he was working, she seemed to have made something of her life. Unfortunately, if David Birnie had a sliding doors moment when he was the apprentice jockey, it happened for Cathy about 1 year into the marriage, when that first son she'd had with Don, who was called Donnie, she was present and watching when a family friend reversed the four-wheel drive in their driveway and struck Donnie, who was killed instantly. It was the death of her son with her husband that she said made her realise that she was never going to find happiness in her life, and she says it changed her forever. But soon after that, it was time for David Birnie, he was coming up to that period in his sentence when he was eligible for parole himself. Now, people have different viewpoints here, but certainly it really helped his application for early parole that the woman he'd been committing all the crimes with, who was besotted with him, was married and had forged a different life for herself. It kind of meant that their criminal partnership was over. Well, that's what was presented to the court. And it would seem then that David Birnie wouldn't be leaving jail, hooking up with Cathy straight away and returning to a criminal lifestyle. But just to be absolutely sure, it was a condition of his parole that he had to take a job. It was as a rigger on electricity pylons in a town called Bunbury, which is about a 3-hour drive south of Perth. So he leaves, he works at that job for 5 days. He stays in the local caravan park, but then on the Friday afternoon, he borrows a car and heads straight back to Perth. Now, who did he visit? Did he go and see Cathy? I suspect he did, but I've got no evidence. He certainly went to his brother Jamie's place. And what he found there was Jamie was talking to a young girl who lived nearby, a 19-year-old girl called Kerry. And David Birnie invited Kerry that same night, that Friday night, to the cinema. And it was the very same drive-in cinema that he and Cathy had been wanting to hold up and blow the safe off, and had been sent to jail for plotting to do it. Before the movie had even ended, David Birnie turned to Kerry, and in probably one of the most bizarre wedding proposals you'll ever hear, he said to her, "Will you marry me?" Even weirder, she said yes. She'd known him for less than 2 hours. They married several weeks later at a registry office in Bunbury. The only witnesses to the union were Kerry's parents and David Birnie's boss and his boss's wife. They had very little money. He'd only just come out of jail, but he wanted to give his new bride a honeymoon night. So they drove back to Perth, spent that night at the Highway Motel in Victoria Park. And the Highway Motel in Victoria Park was 2 minutes' drive from Cathy's house. Is that a coincidence? I think it probably isn't a coincidence. And then David Birnie settled into married life with Kerry, who he called my little sweetie. They had a daughter together, and he seemed to have moved on with his life. And Cathy, by that stage, had several children with Don, and it seemed like they'd both moved on. I suspect they hadn't, but I have no direct proof of that. But I do know that with David Birnie and Kerry, after a while, he got a new job as a barge hand on a dredger in Bunbury Harbour. And while their marriage wasn't perfect, Kerry believed that they were kind of happy and making progress. When one day at work on the barge, David Birnie slipped and a huge 44-gallon drum of oil hit him on the front of the head, knocking him out, and he suffered concussion for several days. Kerry Birnie says that this accident changed his personality almost overnight. His appearance changed. He grew a big droopy moustache and started to wear kind of hippie-ish clothes, and he became very manipulative and started to have multiple affairs, often at the same time, and was open about it. He started shouting at her and losing his temper, and before too long, he landed another job as a truck driver, and it was back in Perth. And Kerry thought that that might be a chance for them to make a fresh start. It wasn't to happen like that. They hadn't been back in Perth very long. They were driving along together, and David Birnie turned to her suddenly and said, "That's where Cathy lives. Would you like to meet her?" And took her to meet Cathy, who was changing diapers at the time. She had so many young kids. She was always changing diapers, I think. But I think that gives a clue to David Birnie and Cathy had remained in some kind of contact for some time. And things really, from that moment, that meeting, that's when things really started to heat up. It wasn't very long before Kerry came home from work soon after, a few months later, to find David Birnie had brought home his new mistress, who was a 16-year-old schoolgirl, who he'd moved into the bedroom with them. Of course, that was the last straw for Kerry, and she left with their daughter and divorced him. The divorce came through and it's quite significant, in July 1985. The murders for which Cathy and David Birnie would commit happened less than a year later. Because what was happening with Cathy at that time, well, she was in a very unhappy relationship with Don at that stage. She was miserable. She told a few friends that she had. They had 5 children at that stage, but very little money, and they lived in a crumbling government housing block. She was pregnant with their 6th child, but what Don didn't know is that when he left to go to work, and he worked in the Parks and Gardens department of the local council, that David Birnie would rock up in his truck 10 minutes later, and Cathy would either, 2 of her children were so young that they weren't of school age, so she would either lock them outside in the garden while she and David Birnie went to bed together, or she'd lock the kids in the house and her and David Birnie would go off. Eventually, of course, a neighbour tipped off Don to what was happening, and he was he might have been 10 years older than David Birnie, but he was much bigger and fitter, and he caught them and bashed David Birnie really badly in front of the kids. Probably David Birnie was only saved by Cathy, who dragged Don off him, begging him to stop hitting him. That would almost be the end of Cathy's marriage, but not quite. She was pregnant. So they had their 6th child together. It was a daughter. Cathy's 7th child, she'd had that son first off. And several months after that birth, she goes into hospital for a hysterectomy. Don, after work, dashes to the hospital for visiting time and walks in and finds David Birnie sitting by Cathy's bedside holding a hand. Cathy went home with Don and her baby to see her baby, nurse the baby. But a few weeks later, when Don dropped her off at work, she never returned home. She'd taken everything with her but her handbag. She simply abandoned her husband and all her children, including that youngest daughter who was only about 12 months old, and simply vanished. Don had a good idea where they'd find her with David Birnie. He went and reported her missing to police. Police found her at David Birnie's, but Cathy gave them a message to give to Don, and the message was, "I don't want to be found." And that was the end of the marriage. She knew that he would never divorce her, so she just walked out. Never rang or wrote or visited her children, just completely broke off everything, which is a remarkable thing for a mother of 7 to do, I think. But it just shows the devotion and the commitment that David Birnie and Cathy, that kind of bond that they'd had, that had been forged all those years before, both having really rough, tough upbringings, and really they just thought that it was the 2 of them against the world. And it was.
And when they did, they were eventually together, their relationship was sort of built on a variety of sexual fantasies. What were those fantasies that they shared?
David Birnie, of course, particularly since that accident on the barge, his sexual depravity had just got worse and worse. So following his divorce, David Birnie needed somewhere else to live, and he bought a house that has now become one of the most famous house of horror addresses in Australian history. Number 3, Moorhouse Street in Willagee in Perth, 1 street back from the Leach Highway. That's where Cathy had run to when she left Don and the kids, and they set up home together. They were together finally. They were smoking huge amounts of cannabis, which they were selling on the side. Birnie was working at a local car dismantlers, but they'd spend their evenings smoking bong after bong, watching pornographic movies. Birnie had an enormous collection of pornographic cassettes. listening to music very loudly. All the neighbours talk about, at this time, Dire Straits were the biggest rock band in the world and were halfway through the biggest tour that had ever been, the Brother in Arms tour. And they were obsessed with their music. And in fact, if you're fascinated by the Birnies, go and read the lyrics, if you know any of those songs on the Brother in Arms album. And there's a lot of the Birnies in there. It's fascinating. Six Blade Knife and Heavy Fuel. Some of those tracks, if you listen to them. David Birnie's big fantasy was to have a threesome with Kathy and another woman. Kathy tried everything to make that happen. She approached a local hairdresser and asked her to take part, and the hairdresser turned her down. David then identified a local real estate agent as someone who they could target and ask. They began stalking this woman until her husband chased Birnie off. You mentioned David Birnie's brother Jamie. In fact, two of David Birnie's brothers did also go to jail for sexual assaults. So all three brothers were rapists. Jamie went to visit and spent some time with David Birnie and Kathy living in Moorhouse Street. And the timing is very significant because some of the victims who police believe disappeared because of the Birnies happened in this time period just before Jamie goes to stay with them for a short time when he gets out of jail. And so several women go missing, and then there is a gap, and then another victim goes missing, and that gap ties in with when Jamie was staying with his brother, because it obviously put a bit of a halt to the killing spree. Jamie talks about once being raped by his brother, and incest is an allegation that's always been levelled at the Birnie family with the parents back to when the kids were young. So Jamie says that his brother once tried to have sex with him because he had this insatiable appetite and demanded sex up to 6 times a day. He also claimed, I've no idea whether it's true, that David Birnie was injecting himself with anaesthetic directly into his penis. So there was a lot of weird, horrific sexual depravity and scheming going on here. In these evenings when they'd be smoking cannabis and watching pornography, I don't know which one of them it was that came up with the idea, but they formed this plan that they would abduct a victim, a young woman, who would become their sex slave. And what may have just started out as a throwaway comment became an obsession for them. Kathy didn't have much of a formal education, but she was the one who went to the local library and took out some books on serial killers. But the one they liked most of all was a book called Perfect Murder. They'd sit for hours and discuss this book and plan how they would commit the perfect murder of a young woman who they would abduct, use as their sex slave, and then, as Kathy said to David, she could then identify them, so she would have to die. They would have to kill her, and he went along with that.
And they began with Mary Nielsen in 1986. How did David convince her into their home?
Yes, well, they began in terms of, we might have a disagreement there. I think they began a lot earlier than that, but it's the murder of Mary Nielsen that is certainly the case that they got convicted of. Mary was a 22-year-old university student who worked in a deli to pay her way through college a little bit. Her parents at the time were from the UK originally, and they'd gone back to see family. Leaving Mary at university, there was a problem with Mary's car, with the tyres on her car, and she needed new tyres. Now, her father had said to her before he went on holiday that if she had a problem with the car, then she should take it to the car yard that he used all the time. It was a car dismantlers and a mechanics business, which is what she did. And tragically, the employee on the desk that day, when she walked into the car yard, was David Birnie. And David Birnie persuaded her that if she was a student with not much money, then why didn't she buy the tyres directly from him, that he had some at home that would fit her car, and he would charge her a lot less than if it went through the business. And that's what, sadly, Mary Nielsen did. She followed David Birnie when he picked her up outside the delicatessen where she worked, where she finished her shift. And it was a 3 or 4 minute drive then to Moorhouse Street. And the moment that Mary Nielsen got out of her car and got into the kitchen, Kathy was waiting with a knife, and they quickly overpowered her. And then began the series of events which all the Birnies victims went through. Kathy, armed with all her research, would tie them up, would then get her notebook out and all these plastic Ziploc bags, and she'd make them get undressed, and she'd log every item of clothing, every item of jewellery that they had, and list it all. And then she would quiz them and take down all the personal details of their family members, their mum and their dad, any sisters, any boyfriends, telephone numbers. Because what would happen is that if they didn't kill a victim that night and they were going to keep them, they would the next morning, again, it would be Kathy holding a white bone-handled knife that Kathy carried in her Ugg boots, which she called Bubba. That was the name that she gave to the knife, Bubba. She would hold it to the throat and get them to ring their parents or their friends and make an excuse that they were out of town for a few days just to buy them time. And they did this with a lot of their victims. They couldn't do that with Mary because her parents were overseas. With Mary, it was slightly different. Once she was undressed and forced to take a shower, David Birnie then would spend hours abusing Mary, and Kathy would be sitting on a stool at the foot of the bed, making notes again about what turned David on so that she could use it when they next had sex together. It was like a research project for Kathy. And then Kathy was invited to join them on the bed by David, and that's what happened. She took part. And then it was the early hours of the following morning where they drove out to a pine plantation on the edge of the city, and David Birnie raped Mary twice more. Then he put a nylon strap around her throat, and they took turns to tighten it with a tree branch. And it was David Birnie who was digging the grave, the makeshift grave for Mary, when she died. And it was Kathy who was strangling her at the time that she died. David Birnie may have been the more experienced killer, perhaps, certainly criminal, but it was Kathy who killed their first victim, not him.
That was part 1 of our 2-part special investigation into the lives and crimes of David and Catherine Birnie. In the next episode, we'll be taking a closer look at the crimes of the Birnies and how one of their victims not only escaped, but planted clues during her capture. Those clues would lead to Catherine and David's arrest. Andrew Byrne is still working on a book about the Birnies and asks that if you or someone you know may have any information about David, Catherine and their crimes, you can find him on social media. That's Andrew Byrne, Byrne spelt Byrne. If you want to support this podcast, then please leave us a review in Apple Podcasts. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our technical producer is Luca Lavigne, and our executive producer and editor is Elise Cooper.